Welcome back. Here we are, preventing fraud in e-commerce. There are three areas to think about because generally we think internal controls, we want to look at 5 areas. You've probably covered some of this in auditing: the control environment, risk assessment, control activities and procedures, information and communication, and monitoring. But because of the nature of e-commerce fraud being online, over the internet, over a distance, information and communication and monitoring are not effective as preventative mechanisms. So we will look at the first 3. Remember, just above me here, there is perceived pressure, rationalization, but in some ways, in e-business settings, reducing pressures and eliminating rationalizations has thus far proved difficult. Because of the lack of personal contact, it makes it hard to know what pressures exist or what rationalizations perpetrators are using. Therefore, we really need to focus our preventative methods on what we got here, just here, the perceived opportunity. And we can do that in 3 ways: the control environment, risk assessment, and control activities and procedures. With the control environment, we talked about this in Learning Module 3 and Learning Module 4, and that is the overall tone at the top, creating a culture of honesty, openness, and assistance, making sure that every one of the employees are totally aligned when it comes to securing data, when it comes to securing technology in the organization, securing and updating of passwords, and having clear systems of control over whether employees are allowed to take computers home or not. And if they are allowed to take them home, then whether they have extra authentication protocols involved. The other part of the control environment is eliminating fraud opportunities. Now, of course, we cannot do monitoring, we cannot do communication, so we've got to focus on the other internal preventative controls in the organization and also having proper risk assessments undertaken. And that takes us to our next part of risk assessment. The risk assessment identifies the risks of doing business with e-business partners. A key part of that assessment focuses on the control environment of those organizations. Are you doing business with other merchants, with other suppliers? Then you need to incorporate their businesses in your risk assessment procedures. Another part identifies key risks in the electronic exchange of information and money. Finally, a specialized branch of risk assessment is intrusion detection. This is where you hire a service company to come and to try and gain access to your network and your information and to report their findings back to management. There is a business out there where you pay hackers to do exactly that, and then they report back to you whether they can hack into your system or not, because you want to find the vulnerabilities. And when you find the vulnerabilities, then you can put resources into shoring up, plugging up those holes so there is no security leakage. So that's what we mean by risk assessment. We are shining the torch on our partners and also inside our own organization. And we are testing various areas of our IT system for breaches of security. And we may deliberately employ ethical hackers or service companies to try and break into the system to give us feedback to find out where the vulnerabilities are. The final part of preventing fraud in e-commerce is control activities and procedures. That's where we look at control activities. And you know from studying auditing, those of you who have, adequate separation of duties right at the top here. Having adequate documents and records. Having proper authorization. Having physical control over assets and records. and having independent checks on performance. I've notarized some of these areas. So if we look at proper authorization above, the most common authorization controls are passwords, biometrics, digital signatures and certificates, and firewalls. And there are plenty of companies out there that can help you to provide that extra layer of data security that forces your customers to go through to authenticate that they are who they say they are. If we look at adequate documents and records just here, well, you know the usual suspects of invoices, purchase orders, records, sales journals. Keeping them is very, very important, but also you need to keep them safely. And that's why secure encryption here is the primary electronic transaction and document control is encryption. That's why having secure encryption is very critical. Encryption is the primary electronic transaction and document control. Above me, because of the lack of hard copy documentation, it creates opportunities for fraud. So this is why we need to have adequate documents and records, but we need to secure them. So we need to encrypt them so that they cannot be accessed by people who are not allowed to access them. Finally, right over the far left-hand corner at the top, organizations should always conduct checks on their e-business partners to prevent fraud, gaining an understanding of management or the organization's business partners and what motivates them is important. And 3 items must be examined. As you can see, just below that caption, we need to examine the backgrounds, motivations, and decision-making orientation of the customers, of our partners whom we are dealing with through e-commerce. So it's not just enough that we control our own data and we secure our own data. We need to know whom we are dealing with. We need to know who our suppliers are, who our other merchants are, who our partners are. We need to know beyond an e-commerce level. We need to know who they really are in terms of their backgrounds, their motivations, and the type of decision-making preferences they have. Let me tell you a little story from my years of experience in working with supply chain vendors in China. One of the big things we used to tell merchants when they're looking for suppliers to source products, materials, was to get to know the supplier. And a lot of merchants came to me and they wanted me to select suppliers for them. I did supplier audits and I'd recommend this supplier A, supplier B, and give the decision to the merchant to choose. In the process of my audit, I got to know the supplier and I always reminded the merchant, ideally, getting to know the supplier is more important than the technical specifications of the product that they are making for you. Because at the end of the day, you are not there 24/7 to monitor their production. It's better to know the mind of the partner you are working with because you cannot monitor their operations, their procedures. And that is the same idea here. Because in e-commerce, merchants, all the different parties are at a distance, monitoring doesn't work. Communication and control in the manual sense does not work. So you still need to do IT controls, but you need to go above that and get to know the partners you are working with. Why are they in the business? Do they have the same mindset of doing the right thing by you? Or are they in it for the quick buck, where you are in the business to establish your brand name and to get a long buck rather than a quick buck? That is, you're interested in long-term profits rather than quick and easy profits. So even though you as a merchant are separated from all these partners, it doesn't prevent you from getting to know them. That's what I'm saying here. So don't throw that out just because you're in the e-commerce area. If we look at all the different services that are available, and it's even larger today, and this is care of the fraud, the merchant fraud journal, you can see that there's a lot of startups in the identity management platforms. There are a lot of startups in the chargeback protection platforms. And then there is many startups in the area of fraud prevention platforms. You know some already, like PayPal. Maybe you're using PayPal. There's SAS. There's also TransUnion, which was also mentioned a few learning lessons ago when we were talking about online credit status of customers that you are dealing with. So you can see, as a merchant, you may be partnering with any of these players to help fortify the preventative controls in your e-commerce system. Okay, so I've taken you through in the previous part what we mean by e-commerce fraud, and I've given you examples of e-commerce fraud. Then I showed you the risks and vulnerabilities revealed by e-commerce fraud. In this part, I was talking about how to put the preventative mechanisms in place to protect you, the merchant, from e-commerce fraud. Now we want to look at what measures can we put in place to detect fraud if we get a sense that it has happened or is in the process of happening. When we are detecting e-business fraud, we want a data-driven approach because we're in the e-commerce. It's very hard to manually, through your eyes and ears and interviewing technique, it's very hard to detect e-business fraud having taken place. Number one, we need to understand the business operations. Again, this is part of the risk assessment. Then we need to identify what frauds can occur. So we get the flashlight and we shine it around. Oh, they can occur when customers sign up to be a customer. Possibly, we need to have a mechanism to make sure that the customer is not a robot. Oh, we need to have a third-party authentication mechanism to make sure that the customer checks off with their cell phone. And we might need to get another service operator to help organize that. All right, so this is what we mean by shining the torch on different areas to find where possible frauds can occur. It can occur when customers sign up to be your customer. It can occur at the transaction stage. It can occur at the delivery stage. It can occur at the product ordering stage. And so we need to lay out the whole business operation step by step by step by step. So that's part two. Part three, we're going to determine the symptoms that these frauds will generate. All right, in the area of customer authentication, one symptom is we have a lot of customers that don't seem to have legitimate addresses. So that might be a symptom that you look for. All right. And then what we do next is use IT to search for symptoms. And so we get IT algorithms, AI, to search for our customer list where the address does not check out. Because now you can refer addresses that have been put in with legitimate addresses on government and council databases. And so you can get AI, you can get IT to do match with the customer address with legitimate addresses out there. You might know when you sign up to be a customer with Vic Roads, the Health Authority, Medicare, when you put in the address, you don't have to put in the full address because you click the search button and the rest of the address will appear. It's because there are databases of address in government websites already. Okay, so we can use databases and information systems to search for such symptoms. And then finally, then we can analyze and investigate symptoms to determine if they are caused by fraud. There you have the 5 steps that we can go through. We're learning the business operation. We are identifying the likely fraud areas. What are the symptoms that we expect to see in those areas? Let's use IT to look for those symptoms, and then we analyze and investigate symptoms to determine if they are caused by fraud. The last part is looking at the future of e-business, e-commerce fraud from 2 perspectives. From the perspective of the skills that you need as a fraud investigator or as a fraud preventer. Fraud investigators who specialize in e-commerce need to understand the tools and methods that perpetrators use. That means you might need to take a course in computer science. You might need to learn SQL, Python code, different things like that. AI can teach you this. It's not as difficult to learn as it was a decade ago. Now we have AI bots to help you to learn these things. Knowledge of web servers, knowledge of Unix, knowledge of security strengths and weaknesses in Windows, knowledge of computer scripts, knowledge of intrusion detection systems. Neil, what are you talking about? It's great to know all this. It will take me years to learn all this. Why are you demoralizing me as a student at the end of this session? No, I want you to feel empowered because all of these areas are learnable and all of these areas are going to explode in terms of demand for your knowledge and demand for your skills. Neil, what are you talking about? Let me show you. I went to the future e-commerce fraud trends behind me, and that comes from the Merchant Fraud Journal. And I want you to look at, I got AI to summarize the big trends going forward in e-commerce. And if we go from line by line by line, we can read a few. Let's read the top line. Generative AI enabling fraudsters to run tasks faster, such as customizing phishing messages and automating account takeovers. Next, the impact of generative AI on scaling and automating fraud operations, increasing attack velocity and complexity. Or we can go down to number 2, identity and verification, the threat of deep fake technology creating synthetic personas, challenging digital identity verification. Wow. If you're a merchant and digital identity and verification is important, then you need to be aware of deep fake technology. If we go down to number 3, payment and transaction fraud, the rising threat associated with faster deliveries and payments, making it harder to recover stolen funds. If we go to number 4, risk management and solutions, the lack of robust risk management solutions to prevent persistent online fraud, hindering marketplace growth. So I want to finish on a positive note here. All of these are challenges to the efficient and sustainable operations of merchants in the e-commerce space. You, as a fraud investigator, being empowered with any of these technologies will be in great demand to help merchants set up their e-commerce stores properly, to help merchants set up preventative controls, to help merchants investigate and detect frauds. This is a good thing. This is a big positive. And it's something that is empowering accountants all around the world to be more cognizant and aware of technologies available to control and prevent fraud in the area of e-commerce. I wanted to finish on this positive note because this makes your career, your future career as an accountant, as a fraud investigator, even greater, even more valuable. Wow, this is amazing. As I said, this is the last learning module where we talk about fraud in e-commerce. We looked at what is e-commerce fraud risk in e-commerce, prevention controls, detection controls, and finally, the technical knowledge for the fraud examiner, keeping in mind that the current wave of technology is empowering fraudsters to create even more e-commerce risk for online merchants. Therefore, there are greater opportunities for fraud investigators, for fraud consultants to help merchants in e-commerce. This is O'Connor, and thank you for watching, and see you in the classroom. Bye for now.